welcome to this third webinar, this time on publishing quantitative studies in academic journals, which is part of this series of 4 on high impact research. And by now you know what ANSES is all about when it's trying to achieve. A very warm welcome to all the ANSES members and also guests, people who have joined the webinar, just interested in this specific event. And in today's webinar, we focus more on quantitative research for this topic. We've brought you someone who not only has journal editorial roles in reputable journals, but also has published numerous quantitative research articles in top journals. And this is Prof. Tom Lumpkin from the University of Oklahoma. Tom, thank you very much for making time to be with us today. Right, a few words about Tom. Prof. Lumpkin is Executive Director at the Division of Entrepreneurship and Economic Development at the University of Oklahoma and has a chair in Entrepreneurship and Economic Development as well. His research and teaching interests include entrepreneurial orientation, social entrepreneurship, and family business. He is a globally renowned scholar and has published in top journals such as the Academy of Management Review, the Academy of Management Journal, the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal, the Journal of Business Venturing, and Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. With over 43,000 citations, he has published quantitative research extensively with his seminal paper on entrepreneurial orientation titled Clarifying the Entrepreneurial Orientation Construct and Linking it to Performance, which has over 12,000 citations. And who has never seen the citation Lumpkin and this to 1996, right? That's the one. Today, we call upon his quantitative research expertise and his knowledge in the field of social entrepreneurship, but also for his role as co-editor of the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal and his service on the editorial boards of 5 leading international journals. Before I hand it over to Tom, as usual, we remind you that as Tom is speaking, you're welcome to drop any questions in the chat box. We will address some of the most salient questions when he's done presenting or throughout the presentation. Please bear with us. We will usually receive a lot of questions, so please forgive us if we don't address all of them. We'll try our best. So now, Tom, we're really excited to have you and to hear what you have to say, and I hand it over to you.
So thank you very much, Alex. I appreciate this opportunity. It's great to be here. I do look forward to the day when I can visit in person with all of you. I have yet to ever make a trip to South Africa or to the continent, and so I'm looking forward to that day. We thought we were going to get to earlier this year, but as you know, COVID stopped that. So let me just say I applaud your efforts to work in social entrepreneurship scholarship and to get published in this area. And it's heartening to see that there is a group that comes together to talk about this, because I think that's one of the ways that it gets done is through through collaboration and sharing. So let me just jump right into my slides here, and I will try to keep an eye. Let's see, let me see this. Try to keep an eye on the chat room so that I can answer the questions that you might have. All right, let's see what happened there. Share screen.
Tom, we will also help you with that. We'll keep an eye on the chat room.
So does that show my slides?
Yes.
And so let me just, before I start, just say that I'm looking at them too, of course, but it has wiped out my view of the chat room. So let me know, what questions might come up. And it's okay to interrupt. yeah, I probably have more material than I can cover, but let's get started. I think one thing to keep in mind is the question of why. Let's see. So why do we publish in journals? Well, as scholars, we're challenged to engage with knowledge. That's part of the work, the job, so to speak, of being an academic. And we have a unique responsibility to make a difference through our efforts to create and disseminate knowledge. And journals are our primary path for achieving that, the knowledge-related goals. So the idea of publishing journals is central to the idea of being a research scholar, to being a university professor, where you're not only teaching and doing service, but in many cases, your primary responsibility is this research and creating new knowledge. And of course, it needs to be knowledge that makes a difference. Let's see, they're not advancing. Okay, so the brochure that Alex published, it had 5 or 6 questions in it that I would address. And so I just thought I would use those as prompts for my comments. And so with regard to the role that quantitative studies play in the field of social entrepreneurship, I do believe that that role is essential. It's really vital for advancing the field. We can talk all day about what this means, what we think this means, what the definitions are, but without empirical research, and in particular quantitative research, it's hard to get traction. And of course, the quantitative research is important because it allows us to create cumulative knowledge and comparative knowledge, in contrast to case studies, qualitative knowledge, which maybe is a deep dive on one case, or studies makes a comparison of 4 or 5 cases. Quantitative studies typically involve larger samples. And so we have this quote. It starts out being about a definition, but it emphasizes the idea of empirical research. So not only does having a definition help with the field, but it also helps with empirical research. And in particular, with seeking to examine antecedents and consequences of social entrepreneurship. And keep that antecedents and consequences thing in mind, because I'm going to share with you a slide, some slides that talk about that very aspect. So one of the questions was, what kind of presently unanswered research questions could be tackled? It's very hard to sort of to narrow down a list, and I'm going to share with you several ideas, but I'm not sure that there's any one that's dominant or outstanding, or that we all ought to be going after. I think it's important to keep in mind your own interests in this matter, what your experience is, what maybe you've been exposed to through your own work or life, and maybe even what it is that you can get quantitative data to examine. I do think one question that's interesting is how technology is being used to support social entrepreneurship goals and objectives. Whether technology is helping or hurting. I think could be a social media kind of a question. I think my understanding is that, for example, mobile phones are quite common throughout South Africa, but there's other technologies as well. In the United States, we have these programs called smart cities programs, and they're all about using technology to more effectively provide services to various populations. And to the extent that there are efficiencies and speed created by technology, I think it's important to ask whether or not that really is making a social difference. That middle bullet though, there is a real important focus of mine, and that is keeping the focus on what makes a social difference. That really phrase is from an article I love. It's actually a book chapter that's been around for a while by Rowena Young on social value creation. And she says there's a lot of research that talks about organizational arrangements and processes and competing logics and this kind of thing. But social entrepreneurship needs to really keep its focus on what makes a social difference. And so I think this idea of developing novel and valid measures of effectiveness and success is an area, just developing good measures is an area that would make a potentially good contribution. So just as an example of that, let's just contemplate for a minute this question of why is measuring doing good so difficult? First of all, knowing what good really means is hard. Is there an agreement on what good really means? Is it relative or absolute? And identifying the causes and effects of doing a good is also, a pretty serious challenge. And then there's also kind of a natural inclination in the world that we live in today to try and relate good to financial values, right? Trying to put a number on them, even not necessarily pecuniary, maybe not dollars and cents, which is, financial, but just quantity, just quantifying is not always easy. If it's something simple like, how many books did we put in the homes of young children? How many mouths did we feed? How many homeless did we help? Those are counts. Those are quantitative numbers that are useful, but it only goes so far in terms of what really makes a social difference. And so the problem is made worse, I would argue, by the fact that methods of social program data collection, the evaluation of the effectiveness of those programs is in itself rather underdeveloped. So it's not always clear how much difference a social organization is making, or how effectively a social entrepreneur is contributing. And so I think there are research opportunities around that, although I don't want to suggest that it's easy, but I also think that there may be novel solutions, original solutions that would help the whole research community to find better ways to measure this. It's also the case that the sort of diverse and overlapping nature of social enterprises makes this more complex. I'm thinking here about this idea of hybrid organizations where they have both economic and social goals, or organizations where they have both. So in the US, we have this form called the nonprofit organization. And sometimes there will be a pairing of a nonprofit organization with a for-profit organization, and the two of them together kind of work to create social change. The nonprofit can receive tax deductible donations, but the for-profit operates a business. Well, how do you measure their interaction? It's just another level of complexity that is introduced by social entrepreneurship that I think is one to consider, one to deal with. Okay, so as an example of how this is not your usual financial return profitability kind of measure, look at what the Mohammed Yunus and the Grameen Bank have done. Their goal is to bring people out of poverty, but how do you know when someone stopped being poor? And so they developed these 10 measures of poverty alleviation. Check out what these are. I mean, there's each one is animated, but I'm going to move through them sort of fast. The idea of a family lives in a house with a tin roof, and each person sleeps in their own bed. Family members drink pure water. All children over 6 are going to school. Loan payments in a currency I'm not familiar with. The family uses a sanitary latrine. Adequate clothing. sources of additional income like a vegetable garden, savings. No member of the family goes hungry, and the family can take care of itself if anyone else falls ill. So these are really interesting and a pretty strong set of indicators of how do you know if an organization or a family has come out of poverty, but how you turn that into sort of comparable, analyzable figures is a challenge. And so I think part of it is to change the way the journals think about effectiveness and success and performance. But it's also, can we sort of translate or convert this kind of information into information that's useful for making comparisons across different social entrepreneurship initiatives. And so this, to me, I think is an opportunity for researchers. Now I'm going to share one of my own papers. I've got a couple of my own here, and I don't mean to suggest that they're the best, but I know the most about them, so it's easy for me to talk about them compared to some other papers that I might use. So here we basically argued. We asked the question about whether entrepreneurial processes were different or not, and we used this model. And if you'll see there in the middle that we just use entrepreneurial orientation. In other words, we kind of use entrepreneurial orientation to say, well, what is the model? What is the EO process? What is the entrepreneurial process, right? But then what we did was we spent a good deal of time, I'm assuming you can see my cursor, a good bit of time on figuring out, well, what are the antecedents that are perhaps unique in a social entrepreneurship context, and what are the outcomes that are perhaps unique in a social entrepreneurship context. And the next slide has got the same information, well, some of the same information. You'll see these again, these 4 antecedents and these 3 outcomes, right? And what we basically concluded in this paper is that it's the antecedents and the outcomes that are where the more obvious differences are between social entrepreneurship and commercial entrepreneurship. Whereas the process, the entrepreneurial process, opportunity recognition, analyzing opportunities, doing feasibility studies, writing a business plan, developing business concepts, all of that sort of thing is actually quite similar. But that what they're aiming toward in terms of the outcomes is also an area where there are important differences. Now, let me just say right off, this article is, about to be 10 years old. And from when we wrote it, it didn't get published until 2013. And I think this is a challengeable assumption in this paper. I really think that that the process might actually be different because it's social. That the differences are not limited to the antecedents and the outcomes. And so I think to the extent that you were to be able to investigate whether the process of launching an enterprise or creating an earned income strategy or whatever the context is different or not, I think is a really challengeable assumption. But what we did in this paper, and part of the reason we did it, was to actually propose research questions to entrepreneurship researchers like yourself. So social entrepreneurship researchers. So I'm going to put up the next 2 slides are what I call eye charts. That is, they're very small print. So I'm not going to go over them all, but I'm going to go over some examples within these charts. Because what we basically did was, on one axis, we put the dimensions of entrepreneurial orientation, and on the other axis, we put in the first one, antecedents, and the second one, outcomes, right? And then we tried to sort of suggest possible relationships situations that might be suggested in each of these boxes. This will make more sense when you see it. So let me just point out a few of these that I think might be kind of good sources of research questions. For example, look at this box here at the intersection of social mission and risk-taking. So it says pursuing social missions will require many enterprises to venture into the unknown, and that's a positive. Achieving social missions may require greater risk-taking. Sorry, I need to go back. Achieving social missions may require greater risk-taking. Well, that's an empirical question. Does it or not? But it also, the next one is those with social motivations may tend to be risk-averse. That's also a research, an empirical question. You know, are people who pursue social enterprises risk-averse? And do social endeavors, social enterprises require greater risk-taking? I think that's a question that you could empirically investigate. Here's another one. Look at competitive aggressiveness and opportunity identification. Social problems that require aggressive action to solve may be less attractive opportunities, right? A lot of people that are in the business of, you know, social helping may not see themselves or be able to be aggressive. And so that may make the opportunity less attractive. Likewise, to that same point, norms of social helping may inhibit organizations from acting competitively. So in other words, a lot of people who are in social enterprises, they see themselves as sort of helpful people, nice people, you know, wanting to do good in the world, and they may not see themselves as sort of, competitive, aggressive competitors. That's an empirical question. That may or may not be a valid conclusion. One more on this page, and that is innovativeness and access to resources. Limited resources force social ventures to be innovative. That's a good thing. But funders and investors may not endorse experimentation, right? In other words, a funder, someone who's about to give a donation, they may make a donation thinking you've already got a great solution in mind, and they don't want to spend their money trying things, right? And so that may be an area where you could collect some information as well. Let me show you a couple from this one as well. Under satisfying multiple stakeholders, this column, and risk-taking, risks taken may benefit some stakeholders to the detriment of others, right? I think that's the kind of question that you might explore. And then payoffs from risk-taking may be experienced unevenly across the stakeholder group, right? Someone may be a winner from a risk take, from the risks that a social enterprise takes, but someone else may be a loser, and that may be something that will inhibit risk-taking. And then finally, autonomy and autonomy. Can you see this one? It's a little bit blocked on my screen. Is the full screen?
We can see it.
You can?
Yes.
Okay, good. Autonomous action may require social ventures to be lost leaders or outliers to achieve social change, right? So in other words, when you think about this in terms of impact investing, it may be that in order to be effective as an impact investor, we can't earn the same return. And therefore, you may have to take some losses in order to have a social impact. And then likewise, independence from institutional norms required to enact alternative solutions. Let me try. I can't see what the rest of that one says. Required to enact alternative solutions. It's cut off on my screen. May require autonomy, as I think. So in other words, autonomy, so here's the point of this one. Autonomy is maybe what's needed in order to enact social solutions. but by doing so, you may alienate those institutional supporters that you're trying to rely on for support in order to make things happen. So you get the idea here. The impetus behind this article was simply to suggest some issues and questions related to the idea of putting together the social with the entrepreneurial. And I think you can go back to this article and perhaps find questions like the ones I just pointed out and others that may be a prompt for your social entrepreneurship research. So that's a little bit of a break point. Is there anything, Alex, I should, on the chat side, or any questions to answer?
Yes, there is a question from earlier, maybe it came from Philip. Philip, would you like to ask it?
Yeah, well, it was with regard to the digitalization that you started with in the beginning. So I see that this is a topic that is really picking up in many domains, although I haven't really seen a lot in social entrepreneurship, I think. So I just was wondering what your sense was, what the impact could be of digitalization on social entrepreneurship, for one, and more generally also what effect the digital transition will have on emerging economies.
So I'm missing your key word here. Digital? Did you say digitalization?
Yes. Right.
Okay.
And also the second part is that there is a little bit of a fear, if you like, that digitalization will mean that some emerging economies or developing economies more generally will be skipped over, if you like, because development has been a long process of, let's say, moving from one poor country to another. When the first one got too rich, you might say, if a little bit, brushstroke. But the fear is that with digitalization, that this process will be stopped to some extent.
There is a topic that's been quite big during COVID here in the U.S. is, of course, this digital divide, and that's part of what I hear you getting at. Is the fact that they sent everybody home to get their education online, and what they discovered was not everybody could connect online, and so I think that the president-elect is calling for this internet connectivity to be a utility just like electricity, so that everybody, even in rural areas, can connect. And so I do think that that's that's kind of an early social entrepreneurship challenge that faded away a little bit. So you're right about that this idea of tackling the digital divide was a good challenge for social entrepreneurship. Because I do think there's a danger, as you say, that those who don't do that will be passed over, and or those that are in areas that don't have access will, in fact, be even more marginalized and isolated. And so, I think that it's an important question, and I would say that in a way, it's not separated from the more general economic development issues suggested by this, but at the same time, it does draw attention to the fact that those who are marginalized and disadvantaged are even more negatively affected by this. And so that's part of why I think it makes it a good topic. Is it does it exacerbate the problems of, poverty and lack of access to goods and services among that group, or is it does not affect, sort of the basics, the essentials of life? I do think it's an important question to research. So. Good, I hope that helps. Let me move on, because I'm looking at the time and thinking about the total time, and I wanted to leave a little time for questions. Let's do this one. Are there any quantitative methodologies which you should definitely get to know well because they hold more promise? I'm going to have to say no. I can't zero in on any methodologies that are especially salient or useful for social entrepreneurship. I mean, I'm going to share with you quickly 3 different things that were used, but I don't know that there's anything special about them in a sense. It's just that they are examples that I'm familiar with of quantitative analysis. One of them is this study that I did with Todd Moss and colleagues. And this was basically a study on that asked the question whether or not social ventures actually have dual identities. And the conclusion of the study was yes. And the way we did it was we used computer-aided content analysis, computer-aided text analysis, where we created a dictionary, as you'll see here, where we asked about the utilitarian identity and the normative identity of the different social enterprise award winners, and compared them to just Inc. 500, which is a sort of the entrepreneurial version of a Fortune 500 in the US. And we found that there was a difference that, in other words, those who self-identified as social enterprises sort of had both identities, both this utilitarian identity, sort of the business identity, but also this normative identity, which is the idea of, of helping, cooperation, partnership, friendship. And so this was all done with a fairly straightforward content analysis using available technologies, diction, and it also only used kind of simple one sample t-test comparisons. Now, I'm not sure you could get this study published in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice anymore, but it is a pretty good way to do a quick study, especially a comparative study like this, where you have, sort of social enterprises and non-social enterprises, or some other sort of comparisons in order to make an assessment. And I'm gonna, like I said, in the interest of time, I'll move through these quickly and gladly make these slides available to Alex to distribute as he sees fit. Here is another one where this was a study of nonprofit organizations, actually Canadian nonprofits. And what this one wanted to know was, if nonprofits develop commercial practices or earned income strategies, does this actually help them or hurt them? And the help or hurt was measured in terms of entry or exit, survival. Did they continue to exist as an organization? And so here, the authors hypothesized that the more revenue from market-based income, the lower their likelihood of exit, right? In other words, they took the position that having some income from a market activities would actually be good for them and give them resources so they didn't have to exit. However, there was sort of a competing hypothesis in the sense that they said that there was a inflection point beyond which, if you earn too much from market-based activities, you would be regarded as not a nonprofit anymore, or not in need of donor support anymore, right? And so they looked at registered charities in Canada over this period, and they used Cox proportional hazard models, and both were supported. This is the U shape that they were anticipating. In other words, the more market-based income lowers charity exit rates to a point, and then it becomes highly detrimental. And their interpretation, as I said, was that they were perceived to not need charitable support, philanthropic or donor support anymore. And so their ability to raise it dropped off sharply. And then here's one more, and this is our friend, I know you've met, Sophie Beck. She's my co-author on a few articles, and Elisa Alt. They're both students, alums of the Social Entrepreneurship Doctoral Seminar that I teach. And what they studied was whether or not there's a link between being empathetic and also feeling having a feeling of self-efficacy in terms of whether or not these social entrepreneurs have intentions, whether people have intentions to start social entrepreneurial practices. And here is the model that was in the paper. And let me just say, this is one of the things that we talk about a lot in the social entrepreneurship doctoral seminar, namely the boxes and arrows idea. The idea of being able to depict relationships and zero in on constructs effectively by using this boxes and arrow technique for creating models. And so interestingly, they were able to use a sample of social entrepreneurship students in both the US and in South Africa. And again, there are some who are not enthusiastic about student samples, but these were students that were enrolled in social entrepreneurship courses, had knowledge of social entrepreneurship, and in some cases, many cases, were at that stage in their life where they were considering careers as social entrepreneurs, and therefore, the reviewers and editors let this through. They used partial least squares approach to structural equation modeling, in which they assessed the 5 latent variables and the control variables in the first step, and then estimated the structure using bootstrapping techniques. And so here, notice that in this article, they reproduced this model and reported whether or not the hypotheses were supported or not, right? So they used the model as a kind of as a graphic for depicting the results. Here's the 5 latent variables and the test results there, and then here's the report of whether or not the hypotheses were tested or were supported or not. And so I think all 3 of these techniques, Cox proportional hazard, a partial least squares version of structural equation modeling, and even some more essentially correlational analysis through content analysis, using content analysis. These are all techniques that can work. And I don't know, with regard to the original question, whether there's any that I think are especially good or especially weak for this purpose. I had a little more to say about that, but I'll do it under another question. So what are some of the most important considerations when designing quantitative studies and getting them in top journals? So again, for research to make a difference, it has to be interesting. And so, this is a really sort of interesting point by Davis. The first criterion by which people judge anything even before deciding whether it is true or false is whether it is interesting or boring. And so interesting scholarship quickly engages the audience. And so down here, it should have been in bigger print rather than smaller print. Make an effort to develop a compelling introduction to your research study when writing a publication for a top tier journal. I was in a session a week ago with family business scholars, similar to what we're doing here. And I was not the only faculty member there. And I'll tell you what, we ended up spending 20 minutes out of a 2-hour session talking about introduction writing. And so, a comment was made, for example, that by the end of the introduction, as a reviewer, I've often already made a judgment about the paper. And one of the things that was mentioned was that there's kind of a 4-paragraph model that's often used to shape an introduction. And you can find this by reading a recent editorial by Jay Barney in Academy of Management Review. Maybe you've heard this already, but the idea, of course, is, sort of paragraph 1, you establish what the topic area is. You you demonstrate some knowledge and expertise about the topic, and it's usually a paragraph which states, in essence, this is what we all believe. The second paragraph is sort of the hook, because it says, in essence, what you've always believed may not be true, right? So in other words, because of this, because of that, we have reason to believe that what everybody assumes from the first paragraph is not really the case. And then in the third paragraph, you say, and so based on that, we have developed a research question which questions the opening assumption and investigates this thing that we've identified as a possible exception. And this is where you state your research question. And the fourth paragraph is what we call a roadmap. And the roadmap is where where you say, in the remainder of this study, we will, and it's like, look at the literature, write hypotheses, we will collect data. This is our sample and our methods, and here's our analysis. Here's our results. And then in the final section, there's an implications and discussion of what we found. And so in those four paragraphs, you need to introduce every major construct that's going to be in the paper. And you need to sell the audience on the idea of why this is interesting and why this matters. And so I would say that this is a really important idea when you are putting together research, is to try and tell a compelling story about why you're conducting this study. Two more things about that. One is, it's common, and this is a common premise for a research study, is because there's a gap in understanding. And this is a good reason for a study. It's like, these studies have proven this and these studies have proven that. But in the middle here, there's some part of this that we don't know the answer to yet. And therefore, we're going to do a study on this. That is a good premise for a paper. That is a good reason. But you still need to address the question of why that matters. So just identifying a gap is not enough. You have to address why that matters. And the second thing I will just say is, I'm personally not a fan of putting a long paragraph about contributions or a long paragraph of what you actually found in the introduction. I think that can be kept in the discussion and implication section. That's gone back and forth during my career as an academic. Before, when I started writing, all of the contributions were in the discussion section. They were never in the introduction. And then it sort of shifted over to where people tried to account for what they had found and why it mattered, their contribution in the opening part of the paper. And I think now it's actually shifting back to making, sort of more succinct openings and more, contribution kind of claims in the end. But one of the things that's important to do in the introduction is to say a little bit about your sample and your methods. You don't have to say a lot. For example, you can put in that roadmap chapter, you can say, then, in the remainder of the paper, we're going to talk about literature review and hypothesis. Then we are going to look at a sample of, X number of respondents from Y source, and we're going to, using, partial least squares approach to structural equation modeling, we're going to investigate this question. Sometimes that's all you need to say, but it gives them an idea of where the paper is going. Okay, so next, what are the characteristics of interesting scholarship? So obviously counterintuitive arguments, sort of like the thing I described a minute ago, this notion of the second paragraph is, we're challenging what everybody believes, right? But then there's this idea of multi-level designs. This is not a requirement, but it is something that's interesting. The idea that you might, address something that's happening at the organizational level and the individual level, or maybe at the organizational level and the community level in the case of social entrepreneurship. Another thing that's increasingly common is to write a paper that uses both qualitative and quantitative data. I think this is gives you an advantage almost from the start. So an example of this would be, we had these questions. And so what we did was we went out and we interviewed 5 people in depth and found that this thing that we believed was true and that thing that we believed was true, but this other thing that we believed seemed to be less important to this group. And therefore, in creating our survey instrument or in creating our quantitative test, we took this qualitative information into consideration. And so that's a very simplistic way of describing that. But I think the idea that you could use both quantitative and qualitative data is one of the things that makes research more interesting. If you have innovative data sets, if you innovatively integrate theories, these are also important. Excuse me. So the next question was, on the reverse side, what are some of the most common features of quantitative papers that are desk rejected? So I have a slide on this, and this is actually based on a little study that was done by the Journal of Management Studies. It's been a few years, but they actually attempted to analyze this very question. And so I got 2 columns here, and one is what are the main reasons for desk rejection? So this is, and you need to keep in mind that there are some journals where the desk rejection rate is as high as 70%. That is, I mean, there's others where it's low, like 30 or 35 or 40%. But even that's a lot of rejections to never even go out for review. And so it is a real issue. The first one is fit between subject and the scope of the journal. You know, if you have a social entrepreneurship journal and somebody submits a finance paper to it, it's just not going to make it. And so likewise, if you submit a social entrepreneurship journal to, you know, a paper to something that's purely about finance, again, assuming that they're highly different, it's just not going to work. So fit matters. The nature and the extent of the contribution. So, you know, this is an important topic. It goes a little bit against what I said a minute ago, because sometimes the decision to desk reject is made early in the reading. But, you know, most editors will also flip to the discussion section and see what the story is on the contribution, right? The rigor of the methods, the novelty of the findings. So let me actually go back to rigor of methods, because here again, when you're talking about effective quantitative analysis, good quantitative papers, you've got to have a strong analysis. And so, you know, this includes both reporting what you've done, being clear about, like, for example, the descriptive statistics, the methods that you use, the procedure you use for collecting your sample, and so forth. That has to be ship-shape, reported thoroughly and accurately. In fact, you know, page requirements notwithstanding, I would say that you want to over-report the rigor of your methods rather than under-report them in your initial submission. You may be told that, you know, you got to cut this out, it's too much, we don't need it, but make sure that the readers know that you were rigorous. And then also the idea of novelty, and that goes back to the very point earlier of, is it interesting? And then there's the notion of the general presentation. You need to, you know, if there's a lot of misspellings, if there's awkward wording, if you don't follow the submission guidelines, these are just distractions for both editors and reviewers. And these can by themselves lead to desk rejection. So then the next column is on rejection after the first review, right? So what are the causes once it's actually been reviewed? Well, theoretical weakness is a major point. The idea that you don't really have a contribution that is sort of sound in terms of the literature, what the literature says. It doesn't build on previous literature. It doesn't have to be a big exhaustive theory piece. It can be, a test of a construct or use of a framework, but it can't be one that's just isolated from all the research that it is similar to. Likewise, a poor description of the methods. All right, so that's like what I just said about the rigor of methods. Here's the point where you didn't tell us what you did. You didn't explain where these measures came from or who exactly your sample is. Inappropriate methods. You've used methods that are a poor match for the research question that you're trying to investigate. The idea of lack of integration. The parts of the paper are not integrated. Lack of novelty. Again, goes back to the idea across from it that the paper's just not interesting. It's something that's already been demonstrated or is something that's excessively obvious. Sometimes things that seem obvious have not been empirically demonstrated, and that's a reasonable paper. But something that's already been demonstrated or is just too obvious is not going to be interesting enough and will lead to rejection. So, and there it is, weak contribution. The idea that there's not a strong contribution. Okay, I've got a little bit more, but I could take some questions if you like.
Yes, Tom, I would like to, one of the attendants, Karen, had a couple of interesting questions. Perhaps one is more from a student perspective about formulating research empirical questions, but I will allow her to ask questions directly.
Okay.
Hey, hi, Tom. Nice. Thank you so much. It's really lovely to see you.
Thank you.
And to hear your presentation. It's been really eye-opening. So thank you very much. So I've got two questions that I'd like to ask, which is, the first is around, this kind of takes you back a little bit to the table that you had from your study where you were asking what empirical questions could come out of, or what future empirical questions could be. So I would love your advice as to how, if you've got any tips and tricks in terms of how to phrase that empirical question, because that table had so many good options and opportunities in there, and you clearly have a knack for phrasing. I'd love to know just what the thinking is that goes behind phrasing an empirical question. I'm hoping there's a magic formula. And my second question is, so I do have to confess this, I'm afraid, is that whenever I do quantitative study in social entrepreneurship, I kind of really have to steel myself to read it, because it always seems like such a linear study method, A plus B equals C, and often I don't find that the results are particularly applicable in our space. So I'm in South Africa. So, but at the same time, there's clearly this urgent need for quantitative analysis because we just get stuck in the qualitative. So I'd really like to hear your feedback as to how we can use quantitative techniques and writing styles, but at the same time not lose the nuance of the individual contexts and experiences that we see in the social entrepreneurship field. So they're probably two technique-based questions in terms of tips for empirical question phrasing and tips for bringing that complexity of qualitative research with the rigor of the quantitative methodology. Thank you.
So Karen, is it?
Yes.
Yes. So those are two hard questions. Really, both of them in their own way. Gosh, I don't know if there is a magic formula for framing a research question. There's a part of me that wants to suggest that you keep it simple. That it's, but I mean, that kind of goes against what you're asking with your second question, namely that it is complex and not really necessarily simple. But I think that, to the extent that you can, gosh, maybe humanize it a little bit. In other words, don't bound it up in the language of research or scholarship too much, but make it more sort of accessible to the reader. I think that provides you with a guide, for one thing, as well as with the reader, a guide to the reader. You know, I do think that one of the things to think about when you're writing such questions is to think about what it is you're really going to be able to answer. So, so what I mean by that is, are you asking a why question, or a how question, or a what question? And I mean, I think why questions are arguably, you know, enormous and don't necessarily come from, you know, your typical quantitative study, right? It's not, can you really answer why a founder might be reluctant to fund, why a donor would be reluctant to fund experimentation? You know, unless it's a study of their psychology, you probably don't know that. And so it's much more likely that you'll be asking a how or a what question. And so, so again, to just using that example, you know, the research question that's more likely to match a quantitative study would be, what are donors' attitudes towards supporting experimentation by social enterprises, right? Or how do donors evaluate social enterprises that are in an experimental phase of identifying social solutions, right? So so I would say, think about the boundary conditions that you're actually going to be able to explore in your quantitative study, and make sure that you're asking a question that that matches what you're going to actually be able to find out. So it's almost like work backwards. Again, this is not the research ideal, I suppose, but work backwards from sort of your data and what you believe you're going to be able to test to a question that you know, sets up those results. And as I said, it's more likely to be a what or a how question, is my guess, than it is going to be a why question. And I suppose where and when might also be, but it's typically where and when are not typically, you know, as you know, unless there's a geography issue or a, you know, a temporal orientation issue. As far as the second question, gosh, you know, part of the answer is quantitative studies are sort of by definition not nuanced. They tend to not be as they're not necessarily linear. You know, they can, you know, curvilinear, U-shaped relationships actually make for some interesting studies sometimes, you know. And so, you know, it may be that the complexity around in a quantitative study comes in your interpretation of the results. So for example, you know, let's take something where there's a U-shape analysis. Although there is a scientific way to calculate the inflection point, maybe what you can do from an implications standpoint is discuss, you know, what would be the reason for there being an inflection point, you know, in other words, what are the complexities underlying why this thing is actually U-shaped and not linear? You know, it occurs to me also that, you know, you think about configurational studies, you know, multidimensional moderators, those enable you to add to some complexity as well. So one of the things you'll find in the EO literature, and I can refer you to several studies, like there's an AMJ by Stam and Elfring on EO and social capital. It's actually probably a little too sparse, frankly. It's a little too much like what you're describing. It doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of social capital very far. And yet it is kind of like this three-way interaction, and there's several of those where, you know, the relationship between A and B is not explained by the level of C. The typical moderator model, the relationship between A and B is explained by it depends on the level of C. That you can only understand the relationship between A and B if you take into consideration both C and D, right? And if you through, like, for example, hierarchical regression moderated hierarchical moderated regression analysis, you can take into consideration both two moderators. And there's other sort of configurational analysis, profile analysis that enables you to say, you know, there's not a simple relationship here between A and B, right? And in the best of these studies, actually, there's A and B are not even correlated. And it's only when you introduce these other contingencies or you know, a different profile dependent on the different environment that you can come up with a sort of a complex explanation or a depiction of what the relationships are. So I hope that helps. It's one way to approach those questions.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. And especially the hierarchical, that seems like a real tongue twister.
Yeah, well, I should be able to say it. I've used that technique more than any other as a researcher. So.
Thanks, Prof. I appreciate it. I'll hand back to Alex.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen. I think Mohammed had a question.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, thank you so much, Tom. So far, I'm enjoying every second of your presentation. So today we wrapped up this seminar on social inequality, and people were, telling us as social entrepreneurship, like in the social entrepreneurship field. I'm referring now to Karen's point that we are trying to legitimize the example was from the microfinance. We are trying to legitimize in the microfinance. However, there are lots of disasters happening, in Bangladesh and India and people. So, and this is because we focus a lot on the main constructs as quantitative research main constructs, and we are totally forget about studying the intersectionality and complexity of the people and women in particular. So this was one of the somehow this was one of the comments on the field. The other one was related to the idea that we are not, even we are claiming that we are really studying, social entrepreneurship and things related to social and social with the wider meaning. We do not really have any non-human constructs in our studies. So we just focus on some the main constructs, and we're not considering non-human unit of analysis. So, and this comes to the idea, what if I'm trying to approach some research and I'm doing some quantitative research, like survey-based research, for instance, and I can't get really closer to the reality. And the only way to get closer to reality is to go backward and do some interviews. So instead of starting with the interviews, then like survey-based or quantitative, methodology, I'll go backward from quantitative to the qualitative. So I would love to have your insights on this.
I think you are identifying one of the things that makes social entrepreneurship research challenging. And in my mind, I don't see that there's a problem with what you call it is going back to qualitative research. I mean, you know, I imagine you could also go in the other direction, which is to say, do a quantitative study, draw the conclusion that, you know, what you found doesn't explain what's really going on, and that, you know, in order to find out what's going on, you had to get to another kind of analysis, namely qualitative analysis, and that you went the direction. But, you know, I mean, I think that you mentioned actually non-humans, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do think that's a really interesting question, and you know, it is a hard, you know, how do you get data about you know, a non-human, except from a human or from nature, I suppose. But you know, I think these are you know, these are the very things that make this hard. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't feel like I'm offering much of a solution here, except to say that you're going to be doing better research. Again, if you separate this notion of how do I get published in a high-level journal and just ask, okay, what is it really that I want to find out? What is it that I really want to know? What am I really trying to understand? Then I think that, you know, it will probably lead you to some methodological solutions. And then the challenge becomes, how do you turn that into a story for a journal? And I, you know, my own sense is that the best journals and the best editors are sympathetic to the idea that, you know, sometimes this is not just a cross-sectional bang, you know, I had data, I studied a moment in time. They are sensitive to the idea that there's a story, and that, you know, it was, you know, first I thought this, then I looked into that, then I found out this aspect of it, and then I decided to explore another aspect of it with a research project, which opened up another question that, you know, was still looming from my very first inquiry, and so I conducted a follow-up study, and I found this. So in other words, there's sort of an arc to what I just described, although very abstractly, that is part of what I think is often can be found in good research, namely that that this was a research question of sincere interest, where there were considerable unknowns, and it took a process to get answers. You know, I think if you can write more in a more story-like way, even a quantitative analysis, or one where you've combined quantitative and qualitative analysis, that it makes for a better article. But I also realize that what I'm saying, it lowers the significance of just the quantitative piece on the in terms of its contribution to the overall conclusion and findings. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I think I've got a few more slides. Maybe I could push through those and then spend the rest of the time with questions. Is that okay, Alex?
Yes.
Okay, so what I've got here, I'm trying to remember what's on the slides next. So the question of targeting a journal from research design, or only once the manuscript is ready. So, you know, my initial response to that question was yes, no, maybe, right? In other words, yes, you should, but no, you shouldn't. And, you know, maybe there are situations where that's an important way to approach it. I think that it's clearly important for you to, you know, have a sense of, well, I don't know, you know, gosh, that's tough. It's just a tough question. I have to say, my MO is to target a journal. My approach is to think in terms of where I am going to send something, and so, but I have had situations where I have changed directions as a result of actually conducting the study, either either to go to a better journal or to go to a worse journal. And so wherever you go, the the point on this bullet, be familiar with the editorial mission, be familiar with the dialogues and conversations taking place in that journal. This is part of what's important. So for example, when Jeff McMullen became editor of Journal of Business Venturing, he actually opened the door to studies from a lot of different disciplines, you know, anthropology, accounting, sort of all over, as long as it was an entrepreneurship story, right? And so he was, I think you're seeing more sort of breadth in that journal now, and it's useful to be able to know that. Likewise, you need to, of course, be realistic about how the quality of your work compares to the quality of the journal. And so that goes back to what I said a minute ago about this idea that you don't always know whether or not what you're doing is going to fit in the journal that you've got in mind. And that may change over the course, including, I should say, the possibility that your paper will go higher. You know, I had a study recently where all along throughout the process, we targeted Family Business Review. We just wrote it for that audience. We really did. And the paper got rejected, and there's a whole long story about that. But we really had worked hard on it. We thought it was a good paper. And so we turned around and submitted it to Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, which I think most people would agree is a better hit than Family Business Review. And we got it in there. And so part of the reason we were able to do that is because, you know, we had added an author who had really a lot of skills around a certain kind of analysis, and the paper got better and better. And so I think you need to have a sense of, you know, sort of the level and quality of the paper and whether or not it's a match for the level and quality of the journal. And related to that, I will add this last point, which is, it's good to get papers published. Sometimes papers don't get published where you want them to get published. And so the typical course is not to go up journal, but to go down. You know, I tried at the best journal, and then I went down, and I finally got it in over here rather than where I wanted here. But be careful about papers that are just thrown at really middling or even poor journals just to have a lot of paper submissions. If you don't have some really quality papers in your CV, then it can send a negative signal. You don't want a lot of C- or never heard of journal publications. You need publications, at least some, that indicate that you can publish at a high level. So I do think that's my last slide, and with the time remaining, you know, I'll be happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Tom. I wanted to ask Bontle to ask a question, because she's asking a question about that ties in with Karen's question and your comment back to Mohammed about quantitative and qualitative. So okay. Please, Bontle, if you're still around.
Hi, thank you. My question was around one of the challenges that I find with strictly quantitative studies is when it comes to the results themselves, I sometimes feel as if there's some speculation around why the results are that way. So I wanted to find out, did you have any techniques around how do you actually interpret, discuss, or explain what you found and what that validity of the explanation is based on? And coupled with that, I find that when you pair quantitative with qualitative, it helps with, for me, it makes more sense. Then you can see, oh, okay, this is why, and can base the why of the qualitative aspect. But if you don't have qualitative, what's the basis for your reasoning?
So, you know, first of all, this is a good question. This is a very good question as well. First of all, if you think about it, the only time that you need to explain your findings in any kind of detail is when your hypotheses were not supported, or when your hypotheses went the other direction. So in other words, you know, I make the assumption, and maybe this is wrong, but I make the assumption that you have made an argument in support of a hypothesis. And if your results support the hypothesis, then you've already made that you've already made that argument in the paper. And so
Okay.
you only need to say a
Okay.
little bit more about, as we anticipated, the findings support our hypothesis, and this is good news. I do think at that point, one of the things that you need to be careful about is overgeneralizing, right? So because you found that, you don't want to be saying, and because we found that, in all situations and, forever going forward, this is true. You need to sort of humble in how you say, and therefore with this particular sample, we believe we can generalize to this limited extent, right? So that's one thing.
Okay.
So then what do you do about?
So qualifying it that way.
Yeah. And so so that shouldn't take too much interpretation. Here's another thing while I'm thinking about it, and that is you can probably save some of that interpretation language for the future research sections, right? So rather than trying to spin up something more than what you've already hypothesized, maybe the thing to do is to say, one can imagine that an implication of this finding is such and such, and future research should look into the possible extensions of what we found in that way.
Sure.
And so that's a way to interpret findings as well.
I see. That's helpful.
Okay, good. And then the question is, well, what about when you don't get the results?
Yeah.
And so that is where you have to be sort of more artful in how you interpret what you found. And, I can't disagree with you. You're right. You are speculating. And the best that you can do with your speculation there is to try to do so in an informed and knowledgeable way. For example, if you say this went the opposite direction of what we anticipated, and maybe the reason for this is found over here in this other research.
Maybe.
Right. So this sort of matches what somebody else said, which, we don't necessarily agree with, but maybe they're right. In essence, is what you're saying, is that there's other research or there's other context which might inform why we didn't get the support that we needed. Also can always say in that part of your discussion, and maybe the problem was with the data. Right, but you don't want to complain about your data if it supported all your other hypotheses. But you could make an argument that if we had looked at this with a finer grained lens, right, or if we had looked at this longitudinally, maybe we would have found the results that we were expecting.
Sure. I think key for me from this is also starting and being clear with what the hypothesis is. And leading with that, and then basing everything else off that. I think that's one of the big takeaways I'm taking from this conversation. Thanks.
Good. Well, let me just say, one of the things I watch for and that I'm critical of as an editor or as a reviewer is whether or not the development of the arguments that precede a hypothesis are well developed and well argued and convincing.
Yeah.
Right. So sometimes you have a little like 3-sentence paragraph, and therefore hypothesis one. And a lot of times my criticism is, we need to know way more about this to believe that this hypothesis will be supported than what you've given us. Sure. And so to your point, if you really, develop your hypotheses in a way that you believe in as convincing, then that's going to be leave the work to do of explaining it in the discussion to be less.
Sure. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Montle. Tom, I have a burning question from my side. First is, what do you mean by innovative data set? And then there will be a follow-up question.
So, yeah, that's a good question. you know, I would say one of the answers to that question is simply being able to scrape data. So with regard to secondary data, it would be able to be scraping data from a source where you typically wouldn't find data that could be used in a management type study. And so my friends Rob Nason and David Gross, some visitors to South Africa, have used found a database with like household data from East Indian slums, and they were able to take data from that and use it in a study of you know, likelihood of choosing entrepreneurship as a career in you know, disadvantaged or marginalized households in India. And so it's the idea. So one of the ideas there would be the idea of finding a source of data that might not tend to have been used for that purpose. I'll tell you something else that we did sort of quickly, and I have a paper, a family business review paper, in which the technique that we used was multidimensional scaling. And so here's what we did. We first did it was a study of dependent variables in family business research. And what we argued was that by knowing what researchers care about, what they focus on, that is what dependent variables they are researching, we can learn a lot about the nature of the family business field, right? So we surveyed like 200 articles over 12 years, and we developed this list of, I think it was 33 or 34 categories, different categories of dependent variables, right? And so then we actually did the following. We put a sticky label with each of those 34 items on an index card, 34 index cards. And we did this 30 times. And we sent scholars in the field of family business 30 index cards and paper clips and rubber bands and a priority mail return envelope. And we said, please group these cards in the way that makes most sense to you. And so 22 of those people actually responded. We got back in the mail these packets of paper clipped and rubber banded index cards, which then the first author, Andy Hughes, did a multidimensional scaling task, and we were able to create basically a framework based on that data. And then we created the initial framework, and then we sent the results to by email to non-US scholars around the world who do family business research and say, this is what we came up with. What do you think? How would you change or refine this? And so that was pretty novel, innovative database. And so I think there's a lot of interesting things that we can do that are sort of outside the box.
Hey, thanks, Tom. My question was about, sometimes I think we don't have a lot of databases here, or, you know, directories where we can find, you know, long list of social entrepreneurs, so we can have 800 respondents, or even worse for social enterprises. So we go with convenience, and we try to do what we can. I mean, random sampling is almost not considered. So oftentimes, you know, out of fear of oversampling our small population of social enterprises, maybe we resort to doing qualitative studies in between, and then maybe every 2 years you can go back to these people. But what is your advice on that?
Well, so you know what my advice is that if you don't have a lot of sources of secondary data, I think I would try to develop some survey instruments where you could administer surveys, even if they're brief, to large numbers of people. I mean, and even if it means walking around a village and handing them out, or interviewing people and tabulating their responses, but at a scale that gives you that 100 plus respondents. But in order to do that, you have to sort of have a well-organized, well-vetted set of survey items. I mean, I don't know of a lot of those in the family business space. One of the ones that Sophie and I are looking at is this. There's an established civic pride scale, and we're thinking about using that to analyze civic wealth creation. And so there may be, I don't know. There's a popular grit scale in the U.S. that's used to develop stick-to-itiveness and perseverance, and maybe there's some kind of a instrument that you could develop that would be adapted to your environment. But I mean, I think that I would not try to take data out of these big databases. I would try to create some instruments that would allow you to originate your own data, and to do it essentially locally or regionally or in the country level, because I think that could give you some useful data.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks a lot.
I need to, Alex, I should have mentioned, unfortunately, I've got another meeting I'm supposed to go to.
Yeah,
I
was about
would love
to say.
stay and visit, but I'm up against a deadline here. So, one or two more last minute questions, but I'm a little bit out of time.
Yes, no, just once more. I think it can wrap it up a little bit for us. It's from Olufemi. Sorry if I don't give him the word, but because of time constraints. So he's asking about, publishing Africa-based research in top journals. There is a little bit of a fear that's because of the dissimilar socioeconomic context. Our research is not going to be of interest to a journal that's based elsewhere. So any experience or advice in this regard as early career researchers who aspire to feature on the international stage? How can African scholarship get into top Western journals?
So I would say that it's good for you to have this concern, but I wouldn't be overly concerned about it. For this reason, if the study is conducted expertly, if you have data that is more or less generalizable, then the location where that data was collected really shouldn't matter. There is a case to be made that there are contextual and cultural differences that may affect the generalizability of your findings, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be of interest to top journals. I mean, even if you made a commentary in your discussion about how these cultural differences appear to have made these findings different than what we might find, in a highly industrialized, that's not a right example, in a Western or a corporate kind of a environment, some kind of comparison. But honestly, I have no reason to believe that South African findings wouldn't be useful in other parts of the world. And so I don't think anybody has a bias about the data. It's much more about how professionally and expertly, scholarly the study has been conducted. I'll tell you, there was a period soon after, Johan Wiklund and Per Davidson and some people come from Sweden, that there were a lot of studies in the United States top entrepreneurship journals based on Swedish data. And it was because they had all this data. I mean, they had the ability to survey the entire population of small businesses, for example. And so there was, I think there was very little concern that the data somehow didn't translate. into Western top journals. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it as long as you do a nice job on your research.
Thank you, Tom. Right, and thank you for today, for this wonderful sharing of your experience, and especially geared towards quantitative research. I'm sure we've all learned a lot, and I personally have. So thank you once again. And thank you everyone for attending and for your support as always for these ANSES webinars. And we hope to see you in the last webinar. So coming up is a webinar on conducting a literature review and how to get it published by Johan Bruneel on Thursday, the 3rd of December at the same time, 4 p.m. South African time. I wish you an enjoyable evening further, and for Tom, a wonderful day ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks again for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be with you. And like I said, I'm looking forward to the day when I can visit in person.
Yes, hopefully soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Bye, Tom. Bye, everyone.